Hello and welcome back. I am Elizabeth and this is Time Scholar and I'm very excited to have you here today. So today I'm going to be discussing what is one of my favourite areas of history, which is the ancient world. And although this is a very long-spanning area of history, it is something that I love. So as previously discussed, I did do my undergraduate degree in classical studies, and through that I did a lot of work in mythology and ancient texts. And one story that really sort of stuck out to me is the story of Helen of Troy, which is what I'm going to be discussing today. So Helen of Troy, the face who launched 1,000 ships, as Homer does say, is most well known for her role in the Trojan War, being the reason why the war even started in the first place after the judgment of Paris, which is something else I will be discussing today. And I feel that sometimes she can be overlooked in place of other Homeric characters such as Odysseus, Hector and Paris. And I feel like sometimes her story isn't really taken into the most account, but she is a character, myth, woman, however you want to see her, that I think is really important to the ancient world, and to Homer's works as well. So today I'm going to be discussing her. I'm going to be discussing, who she was, the evidence we have for her, modern adaptations of her, my own opinions as well, and I'll also be bringing in a bit of extra history, like with the Judgment of Paris, slight things about the Trojan War as well for you. So if that interests you, sit back and get ready. So Helen of Troy is first mentioned in Greek mythology as the daughter of Zeus and Leda, or Nemesis, depending on which myth you read, as it is the ancient world and there are very many different retellings of the same story. And she was born from an egg, which may sound really odd, but in the ancient world it is not abnormal for things like that to happen. Like, for example, Athena was born out of Zeus's head, and Aphrodite came from sea foam. So it's not that abnormal, however it does point to her sort of otherworldliness very early on as well. So her beauty was so renowned as a child, she even attracted attention, and in an early myth, Theseus, from Theseus and the Minotaur, actually abducted her and hoping to marry her when she came of age. So she's been a constant in Greek mythology for a long time before the Trojan War even occurred. So she was later rescued by her brothers Castor and Pollux, who are also big in the mythology scene. I will do a video on them as well if anyone wants to know. And it already shows how her body, her image, her existence, everything was fought over. Helen of Troy was known in Greece as one of the most beautiful women ever, which also leans into the Judgment of Paris. So Helen eventually marries Menelaus, who is the king of Sparta, and becomes queen. She has a daughter, Hermione, and she seems happy in her role as Queen of Sparta, but then Paris comes in. So Paris and the Judgment of Paris is something very pivotal to the story of Helen of Troy. So Paris was a Trojan prince, and he was approached by three goddesses, Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena. All of them were after what he had been given, which was a golden apple. He was to give this golden apple to the most beautiful of the three goddesses, and they all promised him something. Athena promised him wisdom, Hera promised him leadership, but Aphrodite promised him the most beautiful woman in Greece. And that's what he chose. He chose the most beautiful woman in Greece. So he gave this golden apple to Aphrodite, and Aphrodite returned the favour. But the favour was Helen of Troy. At that point, just Helen of Sparta. She only gained the suffix of Troy after the Trojan War, after she had been taken to Troy by Paris as well. So there's a lot of different sources as well surrounding this. So depending on the sources, it's either Paris willingly left Sparta and went to Troy with Paris, or she was abducted by Paris as she was promised to him by Aphrodite and he wanted to make good on his promise. It's a bit ambiguous as well, especially in Homer's work, which is sort of the main body of work we have surrounding Helen as well. So in the Iliad, she speaks about her self-loathing, about her decision to leave her husband and her daughter. And, she can't quite weigh up as to why she felt she could do that, alongside also the feelings that she now has for Paris. It kind of gives the idea that she had some agency, but she now regrets having used that in order to go to Troy, especially since the outcome of that was a massive 10-year war. And Homer's Iliad only covers the last couple of weeks of the war, the ultimate part of it, but this had been raging for years prior to this as well. So Helen isn't just a passive figure. It's really important to remember that she did have agency, which is not really commonly seen in women of the ancient world, which again makes her a really interesting character to kind of delve into. She's aware of her impact, she's aware of her guilt that she feels about having left her husband and mostly her daughter back in Sparta as well. So she's a very interesting character in that regard. But she's also not just a part of the Iliad, she's not just a part of, Theseus and the Minotaur either. So she's also back in Sparta with Menelaus during the Odyssey, which is another part of Homer's works, which discusses the return trip of one of the Greek men back to his homeland after having won the Trojan War. And there she plays the role of a gracious hostess to Odysseus, and she even adds a drug to the wine to make people forget their sorrows. And there's a big question there as to, is it kindness, is it manipulation that she's doing this for? Because again, she's one of the first women we see in Homer's works to have such a level of agency, because she's one of the first women out of the Iliad, and that predates the Odyssey as well. So her identity is very sort of multifaceted as well. So she's divine, she's mortal, she's got a child, she's got a husband, yet she'll still run away for something that makes her happier. But she's also still in debt to the gods as well, having to repay her debt, even though it wasn't hers, to go off with Paris, because Aphrodite decided that was going to be the case. So there's a lot of mythology surrounding her, which makes her a really interesting character to kind of discuss as well. She's a victim, she's a sorceress, she's a seductress, she's a pawn in a war, she's a goddess. There is no one specific image of Helen in ancient works or in pottery or anything either, which makes her really interesting to discuss. So was Helen a real person, or, a name that we could attach to somebody like we can other, ancient mythological characters? Probably not in the way that we think. There's no direct archaeological evidence she ever existed, but she might just represent a wider sort of mythological archetype of a woman, rather than being a specific person. So it's kind of thought that she may have evolved from an Indo-European dawn goddess as well, more divine symbol than sort of the femme fatale that she is kind of seen to be in modern adaptations as well. We do know that the Mycenaeans and the Hittites did have real conflicts in the Bronze Age in northern Turkey, which is where Troy is considered to be. So Heinrich Schliemann is a German archaeologist, who went there, and he did a lot of digging and destroyed a lot of ancient Troy, but there is clear evidence, it's labelled Troy 1 through 9, of there being layers and layers of civilization where Troy was thought to be, where it has been pinpointed by Heinrich Schliemann from Homer's works as well. So there is clear evidence that a conflict such as the Battle of Troy did happen. Whether Helen was actually a real figure or not is very much up for debate. And it does mean that the Trojan War may have been the case, or at least it was very loosely based on a real conflict that happened in sort of the 1200s BCE as well, which is incredibly exciting to me. There is clear evidence that a battle did take place. So it is thought that the character of Helen may have been added as sort of a dramatic focal point later on, rather than being sort of a prime subject of the actual war. The likelihood that they actually went to war for a woman was slim to none, to be quite frank, but it creates a great story, which is why Homer may have utilized her in that way. But it also does suggest that, she was more than just a cause of war if she was enveloped in that way into the storyline, because she also had actual hero cults in place in Sparta and Rhodes, similarly to that of Achilles. So she was worshipped, she wasn't just a literary figure, which is also incredibly interesting as well. So she was something sacred, rather than just being sort of a damsel in distress who was taken from her homeland and expected to be the face of a war. So the boundary between sort of myth and memory is quite blurry in the ancient world, which is part of what makes Helen so fascinating, because, as I mentioned, there is no archaeological evidence of her existing, but for all we know, she was based on a real woman who was at the battle that took place in northern Turkey. So it's all very interesting due to, you know, the lack of evidence that still survives from it being centuries upon centuries ago. However, you know, she is such an interesting character because she may have been based off somebody real. It may have been an absolute fabrication from Homer, which has then come into history through oral tradition. So Helen of Troy is so interesting in that regard as well. So in Homer's works, Helen, especially the Iliad primarily, Helen is seen as really guilt-ridden and, you know, full of remorse for what she did. She's self-aware, but that isn't the case in every sort of ancient retelling of her story at all. So Euripides has a play called Helen, and in this version, Helen never went to Troy. She was taken to Egypt by the gods, and a phantom, and a cloud in her likeness. So, like, you know, imagine a hologram was sent to Troy instead. So it was never her. Instead, she was taken away, and something was sent in her place. It was an amazing plot twist, and really changed the ideas of what had happened at Troy, because before that, everyone just read Homer's work and was like, yep, that's it, the Iliad. Helen went, there we go. Bish bash bosh. But it gives the idea, Euripides' story does, that Helen was more than just an idea or a woman, she was a scapegoat as well. You know, she wasn't just there to be the face of a war. She was used as a reason for war. So they wanted to have a battle, but they needed a reason to have one, and therefore this sort of like fog of Helen gave them a good reason. It's very interesting. I think it's very interesting. So she also appears in a lot of artwork across centuries of the ancient world. Vases, statues, mosaics, plates. Artists show her being abducted by Paris, standing on Troy's walls, but, you know, there's not much else of her other than that in vase and paintings that I could find personally. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But then in Sparta, she was worshipped, which again makes it really interesting. People made offerings to her, not as a villain, as, you know, she's kind of now painted, but as a divine protector. She wasn't somebody who ran away and left her husband and her daughter, you know, in order to marry this prince she didn't know and start a war. Instead, she was worshipped by the people of Sparta as, you know, their queen, or their old queen, which is an amazing tip on the head of the story that has kind of been familiarized and popularized in modern day. Because I feel like now Helen is far more a sort of damsel in distress, or like she's framed as somebody who didn't care for her husband. But that doesn't seem to be the case whatsoever. So the modern adaptations of Helen are something I feel quite strongly about, and not always in a very good way. So I feel like a lot of them tend to flatten the complexity that the character, the mythological woman, has had, especially since there is so much history surrounding her. You know, she was worshipped, she was a divine protector, she was of the gods. There was so much more to her than just being a woman who was taken away from her husband and child. There was so much more to her than, you know, being a damsel in distress, someone with no agency. She has proved in the Iliad that she has agency, that things were a choice for her, which I feel like makes the way that modern adaptations are done very interesting. So one that really speaks to me, I wrote an essay on this as well, is the 2004 movie Troy, the one with Brad Pitt in it. Yeah, that one, 2 hours long, that's the one. And it really struck me in that movie how she seems sort of very cut and dry, very black and white. She, you know, is unhappy with Menelaus, which, as we know, may not have been the truth whatsoever. Paris comes, she immediately feels saved, jumps in a boat, hides from Paris's brother Hector, ends up in Troy, and then she's like, oh no, a war. She's a passive character. She's a sideline character, really, in my eyes, in that movie. Her story isn't given much depth like it is in the source material. It's the old trope of a woman as a prize of war. There's not much more to it. However, modern adaptations are doing far better, newer ones, that is. Like Troy Fall of the City, which is a BBC program that came out a couple of years ago, I think, 2018, 2019, but don't quote me on that. It was amazing though, please go and watch it. She's given more agency. They tend to feel, it feels like to me anyway, that they stick far more to their source material of the Iliad and the ancient works that they have, rather than just trying to make like a Hollywood blockbuster flick. You know, it is so much better. It is controversial in how it does balance, you know, modern ideas of agency and women to the ancient ideals, which is always going to be a hard point if you are making adaptations out of ancient literature. However, it is a really well done comparison and modern adaptation, I think, of her story. Also, in literature, although not specifically about Helen, Margaret Atwood's Iliad, which I can't pronounce very well, I apologise, tells the story of Odysseus' wife, and Madeline Miller wrote a retelling of the Trojan War called A Song of Achilles, which I know is incredibly popular and I loved. So again, another recommendation from me if you'd like to read it. You know, and it's very interesting because they're retelling these stories from a woman's perspective, from a female writer, which is very interesting to read as well. So Helen really is kind of a misunderstood woman, I think, anyway. She's been used as a symbol for men's fears of agency, I think, and that's part of the reason why her complexity is really narrowed down in these modern adaptations as well. So modern writers are really reclaiming Helen. There was a book actually titled Helen of Troy that came out in 2008, which tells, it's a very thick book as well, another good read, but it tells her entire story, which is amazing to have it viewed from the eyes of Helen, because even in the Iliad, it is all from the eyes of men, mainly. So that's another reason why I feel her story can sometimes get a bit diluted as well. So, Helen of Troy. Although not technically a real woman, there is no archaeological evidence behind her, she is really interesting to me. And although this is a very short overview of who she was and the evidence behind her and things like that, I feel like she is very important to the ancient world as a whole. In the ancient world, she has agency. She struggles with her decision to leave her husband and her child. She struggles with whether going to Troy was the right decision. Although it is ambiguous as to whether it was by choice or by force, it also shows the amount of respect and awe that people had to the gods. Because if she hadn't done what was asked of her by Aphrodite, she would have also then caused problems for herself. So the story of Helen of Troy shows so many sides of this mythical woman. You know, she's seen as a woman scorned, she's seen as a prize of war. In modern day, she's seen as a plot device. But then she was also worshipped. She had hero cults. She was worshipped in Sparta. You know, in the Odyssey, we see that she went back to Sparta and she was living more than happily with Menelaus and her daughter. So there is a lot of sides to Helen of Troy, which I think make her an incredibly interesting character in the ancient world. Especially since her sort of mythical lore runs so deep, from being kidnapped by Theseus to, you know, being actually from the gods as a daughter of Zeus, being born out of an egg. There is so much to her, and although this is a very quick overview, I will do a more in-depth one if anyone would like one. She is just such an interesting character of the ancient world, and something that I feel like really is sometimes overlooked, especially since the modern adaptations of her are so sort of one note. She's not just a prisoner of war, she's not just a prize, she's not just something to be taken, she's not a damsel in distress. If you look at the ancient sources, there is so much more to Helen than what we know her to be, if you just look at modern adaptations. Although some of those adaptations are good, they could be a lot better if they stuck more to the source material. Helen was incredibly complex. You know, she wasn't one of these people that you could either like or dislike. There's a lot of feelings involved when you actually read about her in the ancient sources, when you look at the pottery, when you look at the paintings, when you actually sort of take in everything surrounding Helen as a myth, even the archaeological evidence we do have of the battles that did happen in modern-day northern Turkey, where it is presumed that Troy was. There is so much to take in about her as a character, which makes it a very interesting part of the ancient world, I think. And yeah, so that is my very short commentary and overview of Helen of Troy. I am by no means an expert, but I do hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please make sure to like and subscribe, and if there is anything in particular that you would like to hear about, make sure to comment below, and I will do my absolute best to research it and make a video for you guys. So thank you very much, and I will see you next time.